Nobody talks about the blood. They talk about the chicken. They talk about the 11 herbs and spices locked away in some corporate vault like nuclear launch codes. They talk about the white suit and the string tie and that grandfatherly smile beaming down from restaurant signs across 6 continents. But nobody talks about the blood that was spilled before any of that existed. Nobody mentions the gunfight. Nobody whispers about the dead man lying in the Kentucky dirt while a 40-year-old gas station owner stood over him with a smoking revolver. That man would become Colonel Sanders, and the mansion where he spent his final years holds secrets that could shatter everything you think you know about the kindly grandfather who gave the world Kentucky Fried Chicken. Deep in the bourbon country of central Kentucky, where saddle-bred horses graze in rolling pastures and the air smells of aged whiskey and bluegrass, there stands a house that time has chosen to preserve. 5,000 square feet of history, constructed from bricks fired in 1866, when the wounds of Civil War were still fresh and bleeding. The locals call it Blackwood Hall, a name borrowed from detective fiction, as if the house itself understood that mysteries would one day unfold within its walls. For nearly a century, this mansion witnessed the slow march of Kentucky history. Reconstruction, the hemp boom, the horse breeding industry that transformed Shelbyville into the saddlebred capital of the world. Owners came and went like seasons, each leaving their fingerprints on the old wood and weathered stone. Then came a man with a checkered past and a recipe that would change everything. Harland David Sanders arrived at Blackwood Hall in 1959, already 69 years old, already wealthy beyond anything he could have imagined during the decades of failure that preceded his success. He brought with him a wife named Claudia, a 25,000 square foot warehouse he planned to convert into a restaurant, and enough personal demons to fill every shadowy corner of that old Civil War mansion. But demons, like chickens, have a way of coming home to roost. Rewind the clock 64 years. Picture a farmhouse so small it contains only 4 rooms, sitting on land 3 miles outside Henryville, Indiana. Inside that farmhouse, a woman named Margaret Ann Sanders has just given birth to her first child. She names him Harland David, after nobody in particular. The year is 1890. Grover Cleveland occupies the White House. The frontier is closing. America is becoming something new, something industrial, something hungry. Young Harland will grow up hungry too. Hungry for food, hungry for stability, hungry for a father's love that will be ripped away before he fully understands what he has lost. Wilbur David Sanders was everything a father should be. Mild-mannered, affectionate, hard-working. He labored on 80 acres of Indiana farmland until a broken leg forced him into the butcher trade. He came home every evening smelling of sawdust and animal fat, lifting his oldest son onto his shoulders, telling stories by the fireplace while Margaret Ann warned the children about the dangers of alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and whistling on Sundays. The family attended the Advent Christian Church, where young Harland learned that the world was divided into the saved and the damned. He learned that sin had consequences. He learned that God watched everything. What he did not learn was how to say goodbye. On a summer afternoon in 1895, Wilbur Sanders came through the front door with a fever burning through his body. By the following morning, he was dead. No warning, no last words, no explanation that a 5-year-old could understand. One moment the man existed, filling the farmhouse with his presence. The next moment he was gone, leaving behind a widow with 3 children and no means of survival. Margaret Ann did what she had to do. She took work at a tomato cannery, spending 12-hour shifts on her feet while acidic juice ate away at the skin of her hands. She sewed for neighbors, squinting by candlelight until her eyes ached. She was gone for days at a time, chasing pennies across the Indiana countryside while her children waited in that 4-room farmhouse. And 5-year-old Harland became something he was never supposed to be. He became a parent. Picture the scene. A child barely tall enough to reach the stove, standing on a wooden crate, stirring a pot of vegetables, while his younger brother and sister watch with the desperate eyes of the hungry. He learns to make bread because bread fills empty stomachs. He learns to cook meat because meat keeps bodies strong. By age 7, he has mastered dishes that grown women struggle to prepare. By age 8, he runs the household, while his mother works herself toward an early grave. This is where the cooking began. Not in some sunny southern kitchen filled with the aroma of herbs and spices. Not in a gleaming restaurant with customers praising every bite. It began in poverty. It began in desperation. It began with a child who had no choice but to learn. And it began with loss. Loss would become the defining theme of Harland Sanders' life. He would lose his father to fever. He would lose his childhood to responsibility. He would lose his home when his mother remarried a man who despised him. He would lose jobs, businesses, marriages, and eventually a son whose death would break something inside him that could never be repaired. But that comes later. First comes the wandering. When Harland was 12, Margaret Ann married again. Her new husband remains a footnote in history, remembered only for his cruelty toward his stepson. The boy and the man clashed immediately, their personalities grinding against each other like stones in a mill. Within a year, Harland was sent away, expelled from his own family at the age of 13. Think about that for a moment. 13 years old, cast out, alone. Most children in that situation would crumble. They would fall into despair or crime, or both. But Harland Sanders was not most children. He was the boy who had cooked for his siblings when he could barely see over the stove. He was the child who had held his family together while his mother labored in canneries. He had learned early that the world would not rescue him. He had learned that survival depended on himself alone. So he survived. He found work on a farm in Greenwood, Indiana, earning $10 to $15 a month plus room and board. He cleared land. He fed animals. He planted crops. When the farmer decided his work was inadequate, he packed his meager belongings and moved on to the next opportunity. And the next. And the next. For the following 3 decades, Harland Sanders bounced through occupations like a pinball through a machine. Farmhand, streetcar conductor in New Albany, railroad fireman, insurance salesman, ferry operator, tire salesman. Each position ended in failure or termination. Each ending sent him spiraling toward the next beginning. At 16, he lied about his birth date and joined the United States Army, serving in Cuba as a wagoner before receiving an honorable discharge. At 18, while working on the Norfolk and Western Railway, he met a young woman named Josephine King. They married in Jasper, Alabama, on June 15, 1909. Josephine must have believed she was marrying a man with potential. A railroad worker, a veteran, someone who would provide stability and security for the family they planned to build together. She could not have known that she was marrying a powder keg. She could not have predicted the decades of turmoil that lay ahead. They had 3 children. Margaret Josephine arrived in 1910. Harland David Jr. came 2 years later. Mildred Marie completed the family in 1919. For brief periods, they resembled something like a normal American family. Father working, mother raising children. Everyone sitting down to dinner together as the sun set over whatever town Harland's latest job had carried them to. But normal was never in the cards for the Sanders family. Harland's inability to maintain employment drove Josephine to the breaking point. She watched her husband lose job after job, watched their savings dwindle. watched her children grow up without the security she had dreamed of providing. Finally, she took the children and left. What happened next reveals a side of Harland Sanders that the commercials never showed. According to accounts that would surface decades later, Sanders devised a plan to reclaim his family by force. He would travel to the home where Josephine had taken refuge with her parents. He would hide in the woods surrounding the property. He would wait for his children to emerge to play outside, and then he would grab them and flee on the next departing train. The kidnapping scheme never materialized. The children stayed inside. Sanders eventually approached the house and reconciled with Josephine through means that history has not recorded. The family reunited, but something between husband and wife had shattered beyond repair. They would remain technically married for decades more, but the relationship was already dead. Meanwhile, Harland was chasing another dream. He studied law through correspondence courses, determined to become another Clarence Darrow. He practiced in Little Rock, Arkansas for 3 years, finally tasting something like professional success. People addressed him respectfully. His opinions carried weight. He was becoming a man of substance. Then he destroyed it all by attacking his own client in a courtroom brawl. The fight ended his legal career instantly. Whatever respect he had accumulated evaporated overnight. Once again, Harland Sanders found himself starting from nothing, rebuilding from ashes, climbing out of a hole he had dug with his own hands. The pattern would repeat throughout his life. Build something, destroy it. Build again, destroy again. A cycle of creation and devastation that seemed destined never to end. In 1930, the Shell Oil Company offered Sanders an opportunity that would finally break the cycle. A service station in North Corbin, Kentucky, rent-free in exchange for a percentage of gasoline sales. It was a modest deal, the kind of arrangement that successful men would dismiss without consideration. But Harland Sanders was 40 years old, and success had eluded him for his entire life. He took the deal. North Corbin sat along Highway 25, one of the primary routes connecting the industrial cities of the North with the vacation beaches of Florida. Thousands of automobiles passed through every day, their drivers hungry and exhausted from long hours behind the wheel. Sanders recognized an opportunity that had nothing to do with gasoline. He began cooking for the travelers. At first, he served them at his own dining table in the living quarters attached to the service station. Word spread. More travelers stopped. Sanders expanded across the street to a motel and restaurant that could accommodate over 100 guests. He called it Sanders Court and Cafe. The food was extraordinary. Country ham prepared the way his mother had taught him, steaks seasoned with a practiced hand, and chicken. Always chicken. Sanders had been cooking chicken since childhood, but now he became obsessed with perfecting it. He experimented with seasonings, with cooking times, with techniques that no one else had attempted. And then he discovered the pressure cooker. Traditional fried chicken took 30 to 40 minutes to prepare, an eternity for hungry travelers eager to return to the road. But chicken cooked under pressure emerged tender and flavorful in a fraction of the time. Sanders combined his seasoning blend with this revolutionary cooking method and produced something that had never existed before. 11 herbs and spices, pressure fried to golden perfection, a taste that would eventually conquer the world. But before the chicken conquered the world, there was blood to be spilled. Matt Stewart owned a Standard Oil station down the road from Sanders Court. The two men were natural competitors, each fighting for the gasoline dollars of passing motorists. But their rivalry would escalate far beyond business competition. Sanders had devised a clever advertising strategy. Rather than erecting a traditional billboard that locals would use for target practice, he painted a sign directly onto a concrete wall along the railroad tracks. The sign read simply, "North to Lexington," with an arrow pointing toward his service station. There was no mention of Sanders or his business, but the sign diverted traffic away from Stewart's station. Stewart retaliated by painting over the sign. Sanders repainted it. Stewart painted over it again. Sanders confronted him with a threat that witnesses would remember for decades. He promised to blow Stewart's head off if he touched the sign one more time. On May 7, 1931, someone reported that Stewart was painting over the sign yet again. Sanders was entertaining two Shell Oil Company managers at the time, Robert Gibson and H.D. Shelburne. All three men climbed into an automobile and drove to confront Stewart. They found him on a ladder, brush in hand, systematically obliterating Sanders's handiwork. What happened next transformed a business dispute into a tragedy. Sanders shouted something at Stewart. The exact words are lost to history, though witnesses agreed they were profane. Stewart descended from his ladder. More words were exchanged. And then, gunfire erupted. Robert Gibson, the Shell manager, took multiple bullets to his chest and collapsed dead on the Kentucky soil. Sanders grabbed the fallen man's weapon and returned fire, striking Stewart in the shoulder. Shelburne added another bullet to Stewart's hip. When the shooting stopped, one man lay dead, another lay wounded, and Harland Sanders stood among them with a smoking gun in his hand. Stewart survived his wounds. He was tried for murder in Laurel County Circuit Court and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Sanders and Shelburne faced no charges. Their actions ruled justified self-defense by authorities who knew how business disputes were settled in rural Kentucky. But here is the part of the story that transforms everything. Stewart had a daughter, a young girl named Ona Mae, who lost her father to that prison sentence. Years later, Matt Stewart would be shot and killed under circumstances that history has not fully recorded. When Sanders learned of his old rival's death, he did something unexpected. He sought out Ona Mae. He offered his condolences. He offered to help her in any way he could. And Ona Mae Stewart became the manager who opened Sanders Cafe after a fire destroyed the original building. She became his business partner. She was the first person outside of Sanders himself to sell his original recipe chicken. The daughter of the man he had shot became one of his closest associates. What does that tell us about Harland Sanders? Was it redemption? Guilt? Simple business pragmatism? The truth lies buried with the people who lived it. What we know for certain is that the shooting transformed Sanders' reputation. The man who had fired a gun in anger, who had stood over a bleeding rival while another man lay dead, became a local legend. Curious patrons flocked to his restaurant, eager to see the infamous Harland Sanders with their own eyes. Business boomed. The chicken recipe spread. The legend grew. In 1935, Kentucky Governor Ruby LaFoon commissioned Sanders as a Kentucky Colonel, an honorary title recognizing his contributions to the state's cuisine. Sanders seized upon this ceremonial honor with desperate enthusiasm. He grew a goatee. He adopted the black frock coat and string tie of a Southern gentleman. He began referring to himself exclusively as Colonel Sanders, transforming a minor political gesture into a complete personal reinvention. The persona was taking shape. But tragedy was far from finished with Harland Sanders. On September 15, 1932, his only son entered a hospital in Martinsville, Indiana, for a tonsillectomy. Harland David Jr. was 20 years old, healthy and strong, with his entire life stretching before him. The surgery was routine. Thousands of Americans had their tonsils removed every year without complication. Something went catastrophically wrong. The boy developed a streptococcal infection during the procedure. The bacteria invaded his bloodstream, spreading faster than 1932 medicine could combat. Septicemia set in. Blood poisoning ravaged his young body. Within days, Harland David Sanders, Jr., was dead. He was buried in Walnut Ridge Cemetery in Morgan County, Indiana. His father would visit that grave for the rest of his life, standing before the headstone of the son who should have outlived him by decades. The loss devastated Sanders in ways that biographers can only partially reconstruct. Depression consumed him. The reservoir of grief that had accumulated since his father's death nearly 4 decades earlier threatened to overflow entirely. He had lost his father at 5. He had lost his childhood at 6. He had lost his home at 13. And now he had lost his son at 42. Some men would have surrendered to despair. Sanders surrendered to work. He threw himself into his restaurant with manic intensity, perfecting his chicken recipe, expanding his operation, building something that might outlast the pain. He became increasingly difficult to work for, demanding perfection from employees who could never match his exacting standards. The grief transformed into rage, and the rage fueled an ambition that would eventually create an empire. His marriage to Josephine became a hollow formality. They remained legally bound for another 15 years, but the emotional connection had been severed by decades of disappointment and the unbearable weight of shared grief. Sanders sought comfort elsewhere, eventually finding it in the arms of a waitress named Claudia Lettington, who worked at his restaurant. The affair was barely concealed. Sanders hired Claudia as a cleaning lady while still married to Josephine, a transparent excuse to keep his mistress close. The relationship continued for years, a parallel life running alongside his official marriage like a second track on the same railroad. Josephine finally divorced him in 1947 after nearly 4 decades of marriage. 2 years later, Sanders married Claudia, the woman who had waited in the shadows for more than a decade. Together, they would build the empire that Colonel Sanders alone could never have constructed. But first, they needed the recipe to reach beyond North Corbin. In 1952, Sanders franchised his chicken for the first time. The deal was simple. Sanders provided the recipe and the cooking method. The restaurant owner paid him a nickel for every chicken sold. No contracts, no lawyers, just a handshake between 2 men who believed in the power of delicious food. The franchisee was Pete Harmon of South Salt Lake, Utah. Within the first year, his restaurant sales tripled. 75% of the increase came from Sanders's chicken. Other restaurant owners took notice. Word spread. And suddenly, Harland Sanders was no longer a regional curiosity. He was becoming a national phenomenon. For the next 12 years, Sanders drove across the country like a man possessed. He cooked for potential franchisees, demonstrating his recipe in their kitchens, sealing deals with handshakes and verbal agreements. He slept in his car when he could not afford hotels. He ate his own chicken because he could not afford restaurant meals. He was 62 years old, living on a Social Security check of $105 per month, building an empire, one franchise at a time. By 1964, more than 600 Kentucky Fried Chicken locations had opened across America. The company had expanded internationally, reaching Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Mexico, and Jamaica. Sanders's face, now adorned with the white suit he had adopted in place of the black frock coat, smiled down from restaurant signs on multiple continents. He was 73 years old. He was exhausted, and he was ready to let someone else carry the burden. In 1964, Sanders sold Kentucky Fried Chicken to a group of investors led by John Y. Brown Jr. and Jack C. Massey. The price was $2 million. Sanders retained a salary of $40,000 annually as a brand ambassador, plus the Canadian operations and certain franchising rights he had previously sold. $2 million. For a brand that would eventually be worth billions. Sanders had built an empire and sold it for a fraction of its eventual value. But he was done with building. He was done with struggling. He was done with sleeping in his car and begging restaurant owners to try his chicken. He wanted rest. He wanted peace. He wanted a home where he could spend his remaining years in comfort. He wanted Blackwood Hall. The mansion had been waiting since 1866. 5,000 square feet of Kentucky history, 3 acres of bluegrass land, rooms filled with the echoes of a century of stories. Sanders and Claudia moved in during 1959, before the company's sale, before the millions, when they were still building toward a future they could only imagine. Behind the mansion stood a warehouse building that had served as Kentucky Fried Chicken's early headquarters. Sanders and Claudia converted it into something new. A restaurant. A dinner house. A place where guests could enjoy Southern cuisine without the rushed atmosphere of a fast food franchise. They called it the Colonel's Ladies' Dinner House. They planned to franchise it across the country, creating an entirely new chain, independent of Kentucky Fried Chicken. It would be their legacy, their final contribution to American cuisine. The dinner house was everything Sanders had wanted Kentucky Fried Chicken to become before corporate efficiency replaced culinary excellence. Tables set with real silverware and cloth napkins. Waitresses who knew their regular customers by name. A kitchen where cooks took pride in every plate that left their stations. This was dining as Sanders remembered it from his mother's table in Indiana, from the travelers who had praised his cooking at that first gas station in Corbin. Claudia oversaw the daily operations, while Sanders traveled the world making appearances for the company he no longer controlled. She hired staff, managed inventory, greeted guests who arrived hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Colonel in his natural habitat. On lucky evenings, Sanders himself would emerge from the mansion to shake hands and pose for photographs, the smiling grandfather that America had come to love. But shadows were gathering on the horizon. But the new owners of Kentucky Fried Chicken were watching, and they did not like what they saw. The dark secret behind Colonel Sanders' KFC mansion, Part 2 of 2. The lawyers arrived like vultures circling wounded prey. By 1971, Colonel Sanders had become Kentucky Fried Chicken's most vocal critic. The company that bore his name, that plastered his face on every bucket and billboard, was serving food that the Colonel himself described as unfit for consumption. The gravy especially enraged him. He had spent years developing a sauce so delicious that customers would, in his words, throw away the chicken and just eat the gravy. The new owners had replaced it with something he compared to wallpaper paste. Sanders did not keep his opinions private. He gave interviews to newspapers and magazines, denouncing the company that had paid him $2 million. He made surprise visits to franchise locations, tasting the food like an inspector at a failing restaurant. When the chicken disappointed him, he swept plates off tables and called the product goddamn slop. He was 80 years old, wealthy beyond imagining, and absolutely unwilling to watch his life's work be destroyed by corporate cost-cutting. The new owners were patient at first. They tolerated the criticism. They understood that the Colonel was beloved by the public, and that attacking him would damage the brand. But when they learned of his plans to franchise the Colonel's Ladies' Dinner House as a competing chain, their patience evaporated. The lawsuit that followed would reshape the final decade of Sanders's life. Kentucky Fried Chicken's lawyers claimed that Sanders's new restaurant violated the terms of his sale agreement. They argued that the Colonel was using his name and reputation to compete directly with the company that had purchased those assets. They demanded that he cease operations immediately. Sanders responded with the fury of a man who had been fighting since childhood. He filed a countersuit demanding $122 million in damages. He accused the company of misusing his image and destroying the quality standards he had established. He vowed to fight until his last breath. The legal battle consumed months of depositions, motions, and negotiations. Lawyers on both sides accumulated billable hours, while the restaurant industry watched with fascination. The grandfather who smiled from every Kentucky Fried Chicken advertisement was at war with the company that had made him famous. In the end, both sides retreated to a compromise. Sanders received $1 million in settlement. The restaurant was renamed Claudia Sanders Dinner House, stripping away any direct reference to the Colonel himself. And Sanders agreed to stop publicly criticizing Kentucky Fried Chicken, though not before giving the new owners a personal cooking lesson to demonstrate how their food should actually taste. The settlement preserved Sanders' dinner house, but extracted a price. He had been silenced. The man who had never backed down from a fight, who had shot a business rival and testified against him in court, who had built an empire through sheer stubborn will, was now contractually obligated to hold his tongue. The irony burned like acid. Sanders had created Kentucky Fried Chicken from nothing. He had developed the recipe. He had designed the cooking method. He had personally recruited hundreds of franchisees, driving across the country in his old car, sleeping in parking lots to save money. And now strangers owned his name, his face, his legacy. They could serve food he considered garbage, and he was legally prohibited from saying so in public. Some men would have accepted the arrangement quietly, counting their millions and enjoying their retirement. But Harland Sanders had never been that kind of man. The rage that had fueled his entire life did not disappear simply because lawyers told him to be quiet. It festered beneath the surface, emerging in private moments, poisoning whatever peace he might have found. He retreated to Blackwood Hall. The mansion embraced him like an old friend welcoming a weary traveler. Its rooms had witnessed enough history to understand that all empires eventually crumble, that all battles eventually end, that even the most ferocious fighters eventually lay down their weapons. Within those walls, Sanders could finally rest. But rest did not come easily to a man who had been working since age 6. He continued traveling, making appearances at Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises around the world. He signed autographs, posed for photographs, smiled that familiar smile for crowds who had no idea what lay behind the grandfatherly mask. The white suit became his uniform, his costume, his prison. He wore it every day without exception, transforming himself into the living embodiment of a corporate brand. At night, he returned to Blackwood Hall. He sat in the dining room beneath chandeliers that had illuminated more than a century of Kentucky evenings. He walked through rooms where his memorabilia accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river. The Kentucky Colonel certificate that had inspired his reinvention. Letters from politicians and celebrities. Photographs of a man transforming from desperate entrepreneur to cultural icon. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of that old mansion, the ghosts gathered. His father, dead before Harland understood what death meant. His son, dead from a surgery that should have been routine. His first wife, abandoned for a mistress who became his second wife. The man he had shot in North Corbin, whose daughter had somehow become his business partner. All the people he had hurt, disappointed, betrayed, and outlived. What did Sanders think about during those long nights? What regrets haunted him? What memories refused to fade no matter how many years passed? We know that he gave interviews in which he discussed his failures openly. He talked about the son who died. He acknowledged his troubled first marriage. He admitted that his temper had cost him opportunities and relationships throughout his life. The man behind the white suit was more complex, more damaged, more human than any advertisement could capture. Claudia was there through all of it. The woman who had waited years as his mistress, who had finally become his wife in 1949, who had supported him through the lawsuit and the settlement and the long twilight of his fame. She managed the dinner house while he traveled. She mixed spices and coordinated with franchisees when the company was young. She was the partner he had always needed but had taken decades to recognize. Together, they transformed Blackwood Hall into something between a home and a museum. The kitchen where Sanders had trained franchisees still contained the original stove, its surface blackened by years of cooking demonstrations. Display cases held artifacts from every chapter of his remarkable journey. Visitors could tour the mansion by appointment, walking through the same rooms where the Colonel ate breakfast and read newspapers and contemplated the strange trajectory of his existence. The Claudia Sanders dinner house flourished in its own right. The restaurant could seat more than 700 guests across multiple dining rooms. The menu featured authentic Southern cuisine, prepared according to recipes that Sanders himself had developed. Country ham and biscuits, fried green tomatoes, vegetables prepared the way his mother had taught him in that farmhouse in Indiana, and chicken, of course, always chicken. But this was not Kentucky Fried Chicken. This was something different, something slower, something that invited guests to sit down and savor their meals rather than grabbing a bucket and racing back to the highway. Sanders called it the original recipe, a subtle jab at the company that had purchased his name but not his standards. The dinner house attracted pilgrims from across the country, entrepreneurs seeking inspiration from a man who had achieved success after decades of failure, food historians researching the origins of the fast food industry, families celebrating milestones in the same rooms where a legend had spent his final years. Each visitor added another layer to the story of Blackwood Hall. Meanwhile, the man who had built it all was slowly fading. In June of 1980, doctors delivered news that surprised no one who had watched Sanders carefully over the preceding months. The tests confirmed acute leukemia. His blood, the fundamental substance of his body, had turned cancerous. At 89 years old, after surviving poverty and abandonment and gunfights and corporate warfare, Harland Sanders had encountered an enemy that no amount of stubbornness could defeat. He responded the way he had responded to every challenge in his life. He kept working. Throughout the summer and fall of 1980, Sanders continued making public appearances. He donned his white suit and traveled to franchise locations, smiling for cameras, signing autographs, pretending that death was not stalking him through the corridors of his failing body. The public saw a cheerful grandfather enjoying his golden years. They did not see the exhaustion, the pain, the knowledge that each appearance might be his last. On November 7th, he was hospitalized in Louisville for a kidney and bladder infection. While doctors treated the immediate problem, pneumonia set in, for the third time that year. His immune system, ravaged by leukemia, could not mount an effective defense. He slipped into critical condition. Claudia kept vigil at his bedside. His daughters Margaret and Mildred traveled to Louisville. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered in hospital corridors, waiting for news that everyone knew would eventually be terrible. On December 16, 1980, at Jewish Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, Colonel Harland David Sanders died. He was 90 years old. The official cause was pneumonia, complicated by leukemia. The unofficial cause was a lifetime of fighting that had finally exhausted even his legendary reserves of determination. But death did not end the performance. Not for a man who had spent his final decades as a living brand. The body was transported to Hall Taylor Funeral Home in Shelbyville, where Sanders was dressed in his trademark white suit, white shirt, and black string tie. His walking cane was positioned under his right arm, as if he might spring up at any moment and stride out to make another personal appearance. Mourners filed past the open casket, paying respects to a face they recognized from 1,000 restaurant signs. Governor John Y. Brown, Jr. ordered flags across Kentucky lowered to half-staff. The same man who had purchased Kentucky Fried Chicken from Sanders 16 years earlier, who had transformed a regional restaurant into a global empire, now presided over the state that Sanders had adopted as his own. The body lay in state in the rotunda of the Kentucky State Capitol in Frankfort, beneath the marble dome where Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis gazed down in bronze. Sanders had achieved an honor reserved for Kentucky's greatest citizens. The boy who had been cast out of his home at 13 now rested among presidents and statesmen. The funeral service drew more than 500 mourners to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary chapel. At Sanders's request, Pat Boone sang "He Touched Me," a gospel song that spoke to the complicated faith of a man who had lived violently but died peacefully. The congregation listened to eulogies praising a life of perseverance, determination, and ultimate triumph over impossible odds. What the eulogies did not mention was the shooting, or the infidelities, or the broken first marriage, or the son who died from a routine surgery, or the years of failure that preceded the decades of success. The funeral celebrated the legend. The complications were buried along with the man. After the service, Sanders's body was displayed at Kentucky Fried Chicken headquarters in Louisville. More than 1,000 people filed past the casket, saying goodbye to the face that had sold them chicken for as long as they could remember. Employees wore the black string ties that had become Sanders' trademark. Floral arrangements lined the walls with colors that seemed too bright for a funeral. On December 20th, 1980, Colonel Harland Sanders was laid to rest in Cave Hill Cemetery. The historic graveyard sprawls across rolling Louisville hills, its grounds dotted with monuments to explorers, soldiers, and captains of industry. George Rogers Clark is buried there. 5,000 Civil War dead rest in its soil. And now, the man who had revolutionized American fast food would spend eternity among them. The monument features a bust of Sanders, sculpted by his daughter Margaret. 4 columns support the structure, suggesting classical permanence. Visitors who make the pilgrimage can see him exactly as he appeared in life, smiling that grandfatherly smile, frozen forever in bronze above the grave where his body slowly returns to the Kentucky earth. Claudia survived him by 16 years. She continued operating the dinner house, maintaining the standards that Sanders had established, preserving his memory for visitors who came seeking inspiration along with their fried chicken. She died on December 31st, 1996, at the age of 94. They buried her beside her husband in Cave Hill Cemetery. The monuments stand together now, Colonel and Lady, reunited in death as they had been through the final decades of their partnership. But Blackwood Hall remains. Walk through the mansion today, and you will find a time capsule preserving a vanished era. The kitchen stove still bears the scorch marks of countless cooking demonstrations. The memorabilia still occupies the display cases where Sanders himself arranged it. The rooms still echo with the presence of a man who filled them for more than 2 decades. After Claudia's death, the Settles family took over stewardship of the property. Thomas and Cherry Settle had worked with the Sanders family for years, and they maintained both the mansion and the dinner house according to the standards the Colonel had established. For decades, they welcomed guests who traveled from across the country seeking a connection to fast food history. The dinner house served what regulars called the original recipe. Chicken prepared according to methods that Sanders developed before he sold Kentucky Fried Chicken. Side dishes and desserts from recipes that the Colonel and Claudia had perfected over decades of operation. A dining experience that recalled an era before drive-through windows and paper buckets, when eating fried chicken meant sitting down at a table and taking your time. But time catches everyone eventually, even stewards of legend. In 2022, the Settles announced that Blackwood Hall and the Claudia Sanders Dinner House were available for purchase. The listing included everything: the historic mansion, the restaurant and banquet facilities, the recipes, the memorabilia, and, most intriguingly, the rights to the Claudia Sanders name and likeness, offering a potential buyer the opportunity to franchise the concept that Colonel Sanders had envisioned more than 50 years earlier. The announcement sent ripples through the food industry. This was not merely commercial real estate changing hands. This was the opportunity to own a piece of American culinary history. The home where Kentucky Fried Chicken's founder spent his final years. The restaurant where he served chicken according to his original standards. The artifacts that documented his journey from poverty to global fame. What would become of it all? Would a new owner preserve the mansion as a museum, maintaining the artifacts and the atmosphere that made Blackwood Hall unique? Would someone revive the franchise dreams that Sanders and Claudia had pursued before the lawsuit shut them down? Or would the property be redeveloped, the old buildings demolished, the history bulldozed to make way for something new? The questions remain unanswered. The story continues to unfold. But perhaps the most important question is not about real estate or restaurants or franchise opportunities. Perhaps the most important question is about the man himself. Who was Colonel Harland Sanders really? The advertisements show us a kindly grandfather in a white suit, smiling benevolently while offering buckets of delicious chicken. The brand has cultivated this image for decades, presenting Sanders as an embodiment of Southern hospitality and American entrepreneurship. But Blackwood Hall tells a different story. Within these walls, the full complexity of Harland Sanders becomes impossible to ignore. Here lived a man who shot his business rival and stood over the bleeding body without remorse. Here lived a man who cheated on his first wife for years before finally divorcing her and marrying his mistress. Here lived a man who lost his father at 5, his childhood at 6, his home at 13, and his only son at 42. Here lived a man who failed at everything he tried until he was past 60, then built one of the most successful restaurant chains in history through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The memorabilia in these rooms does not distinguish between the light and the dark. The Kentucky Colonel certificate hangs beside photographs of a man whose temper was legendary. The letters from presidents and celebrities share space with artifacts from a life marked by violence and infidelity. The mansion preserves everything, the triumphs and the tragedies intermingled, like herbs and spices in a secret recipe. Perhaps that is the true lesson of Blackwood Hall. Success does not erase suffering. Fame does not heal trauma. Wealth does not compensate for loss. Harland Sanders achieved everything the American dream promises, and he carried his wounds with him to the grave. The kitchen stove still waits for a cook who will never return. The dining room still echoes with conversations that ended decades ago. The bedroom where Sanders spent his final nights still holds the silence of a man confronting mortality after a lifetime of fighting. And somewhere in the quiet corners of this old mansion, the secrets still whisper to anyone willing to listen. They whisper about a 5-year-old boy standing at a deathbed, watching his father slip away. They whisper about a 6-year-old child cooking for his hungry siblings while his mother worked in a cannery. They whisper about a 13-year-old outcast, banished from his own family, learning to survive in a world that offered no mercy. They whisper about a gunfight over a painted sign, about blood soaking into Kentucky dirt, about a rivalry that ended in prison for one man and legend for another. They whisper about a son who should have survived a routine surgery, about a father who never recovered from the loss, about a grave in Indiana that no amount of success could fill. They whisper about a woman who waited years as a mistress before becoming a wife, about marriages broken and rebuilt, about the complicated love stories that unfold behind the closed doors of famous people. They whisper about chicken, 11 herbs and spices, a recipe that conquered the world, An empire built on poverty and determination and loss. This is the legacy of Blackwood Hall, not the sanitized version that appears in corporate histories and marketing materials, not the inspirational tale of an elderly man who achieved success through persistence alone, but the full, complicated, human story of Harland David Sanders, who was born in a 4-room farmhouse, who lost everyone he ever loved, who shot a man and built an empire, and spent his final years in a Civil War mansion wondering if any of it had been worth the cost. The white suit still hangs in the closet. The walking cane still leans against the wall. The kitchen stove still bears the marks of 1,000 chicken dinners. And Blackwood Hall still keeps its secrets, waiting for the next chapter of a story that began in 1866 and continues to unfold today. Some mansions are simply buildings, stone and wood and mortar assembled into shapes that shelter their occupants from weather and time. But Blackwood Hall is something more. It is a testament to the complexity of success. It is a reminder that behind every smiling face, on every advertisement, there is a human being with struggles and sorrows that no marketing campaign can capture. It is proof that the American dream, for all its promises of redemption, cannot erase the wounds we carry from our past. Colonel Harland Sanders achieved everything he set out to achieve. He became wealthy. He became famous. He created a brand that outlived him and continues to thrive decades after his death. By any measure, his life was a spectacular success. But he was also a man who lost his father before he understood what loss meant. A man who was cast out of his home as a child. A man who shot his business rival. A man who buried his only son. A man who hurt the people closest to him in ways that can never be undone. Blackwood Hall knew all of it. The mansion witnessed his triumphs and his failures, his joys and his sorrows, the public performances and the private anguish. And now, perhaps, you know it too. This is the dark secret behind Colonel Sanders' KFC mansion. Not a single shocking revelation, but a lifetime of complexity that challenges everything we think we know about the kindly grandfather in the white suit. He was real. He was flawed. He was human. And his story deserves to be told in full.